context media. Well, good morning. I'm Stewart Patrick. I'm a senior fellow and director of the Global Order Institutions program at the Carnegie Endowment. It's my great privilege to welcome you to this meeting on a perennial and seemingly intractable topic, that is the challenge of UN Security Council reform. I'm honored today to be joined by three distinguished scholars and seasoned UN observers who contributed to a 15-author compendium that I edited titled UN Security Council Reform, What the World Thinks. They are Sithembile Mbete, who is Director of Programs at Futurelect in which is a Johannesburg-based NGO. She's also a lecturer at the University of Pretoria, and she wrote about council reform from an African Union perspective. Our second guest is Rohan Mukherjee, who is Assistant Professor of International Relations at the London School of Economics, and he authored the piece on India's attitude towards council reform. Finally, Anjali Dayal is Associate Professor of International Politics at Fordham University in New York, and she wrote on this topic from a U.S. perspective. So welcome to you all. Before engaging our speakers in conversation, I wanted to provide a bit of background to our compendium and to offer a few framing remarks to situate our discussion. As I argue in the overview piece to this compendium, the compendium provides a timely snapshot of the diplomatic landscape at a time when the issue of council reform has again risen to the top of the global agenda, particularly with respect to the United States. Besides our three panelists, the compendium included essays from a dozen other authors, and these covered the attitudes of the other four permanent members as well as the United States, that is China, France, Russia, and the UK, as well as of Brazil, Germany, and Japan, which along with India are the three other main candidates for permanent membership. It also included essays on Nigeria and South Africa, the two leading African aspirants, as well as Mexico and Turkey, which are two middle powers that favor expansion, but only in the Council's elected membership. Finally, we included a view from Singapore, an influential island city-state that has helped carve out an expanded peace and security role for the UN General Assembly. Well, as you all know, Security Council reform is among the most persistent and controversial items on the global agenda. The permanent membership has not changed since 1945, and elected membership has only changed once in 1965 with the addition of 4 new members. Meanwhile, the UN has expanded from 51 to 193 members. And compounding frustrations amongst the general membership, the P5 retain veto power, of course, which enables them to abuse their power and block resolutions inimical to their interests, producing frequent paralysis, most recently in the case of Ukraine. Many around the world increasingly complain that the Council is neither effective in fulfilling its mandate nor representative of the world in 2023. At the same time, UN member states disagree sharply over the contours of any potential expansion. Should enlargement be restricted to new elected members only, for instance? Or should it include new permanent ones? And how many in each category? Likewise, the vast majority of UN member states loathe the veto, but the P5 resist encroachment on this prerogative. Finally, there are lingering doubts as to whether any plausible enlargement of the UN Security Council would actually make it more effective and more credible in going about its business. At the opening of last year's UN General Assembly, as you recall, President Joe Biden surprised the world by expressing US support for permanent membership for not just Germany, Japan, and India, which the US has long supported, but also for the first time for Africa and Latin America, without, of course, naming the specific countries. Whatever the sincerity of this gesture, there's no question that it's restarted a flurry of diplomatic activity on this perennial question, which has been the subject for more than 2 decades of an aptly named open-ended working group on UN Security Council reform. It's also placed pressure on large countries and regional blocs to clarify their positions rather than engage in political theater. The big question is anything different this time around? In the wake of President Biden's announcement, we thought it would be interesting to take the global pulse. We asked each contributor to this compendium to assess the Council's current health, to explain the desirable shape of any UN reform, and outline a plausible pathway for reform if one exists, and explain how it would affect the Council's performance. Finally, we asked contributors to consider the ramifications of indefinite paralysis. There's one thing the essays make clear, which is not totally surprising. The odds of sweeping Council reform remain long. UN members are still deadlocked in 3 main blocs. The first is the G4 coalition, which is comprised of the major aspirants and their allies, that is, aspirants of permanent membership. The second is a so-called Uniting for Consensus group, which is spearheaded by their regional rivals. And the third is the 34-member African Union bloc, which is committed to the Eswatini consensus, about which we'll hear more soon. There are at least a couple of pathways for the UN Security Council reform, but they remain narrow, and each would require very big compromises. Finally, I should note that procedural hurdles for charter reform are very high. Any shift in the Council's membership or veto rules would require the approval of 2/3 of all UN member states, including all the P5, as well as passage of relevant domestic legislation. Given intense geopolitical competition between East and West, to say nothing of the potential hurdles in the US Senate, P5 accord on this matter is likely to remain elusive, at least in the short term. At the same time, dissatisfaction with the Council is clearly building, and its legitimacy and credibility are declining. And this is true on both performance and representational grounds. It's failed to prevent the war in Ukraine and has an uneven track record in addressing other threats to international peace and security. Meanwhile, to many, its composition seems increasingly anachronistic. Many believe the Council's archaic composition and dysfunction threatens a full-blown legitimacy crisis. With that fairly sober overview, I'll now turn to our speakers. Rather than ask them to deliver prepared remarks, I've requested that this be sort of a more free-flowing conversation. And if time permits, we'll take a couple of questions from our online audience. So please place them in the YouTube chat. Let me begin, if I may, with a general question about the rationale for and desirable contours of Council reform as seen from your respective regional or national vantage points. And I'd like to start with getting an African perspective. Sithembile, could you give us some background on the AU's official position and why reform is seen as such an important objective on the continent?
Sure. Thanks so much, Stewart, and it's great to be here on this platform with all of you. So the AU has a position that's been called the Ezulwini Consensus, and was a meeting that was held in Eswatini at around the time that the former Secretary General of the UN, Kofi Annan, had raised the issue around UN Security Council reform again, so around 2004. And basically, for African countries, permanent African representation on the Security Council is important because 50% of the Council's meetings are about African conflicts, 70% of its resolutions deal and refer to African conflicts. And so having no permanent representation for this conflict, for this continent where the UN does most of its work, is considered to be unjust. Also, the majority of African states didn't exist as states in 1945, and so the opportunity for Africa to be part of the UN Security Council didn't exist when the UN was formed. And so there's this idea of really correcting a historical injustice. And so that's the main reason why for African states, there's been this rationale of wanting to reform the Security Council to provide greater agency to African countries to be able to deal with conflicts on the continent, but also to have full representation in very critical decisions that affect the lives of millions of Africans.
That's a very clear answer. Thank you so much. I wanted to follow up on that. My understanding is the Eswatini consensus envisions, at least for Africa, at least 3 new elected members, but then also 2 permanent members with full veto power as long as the veto continues to exist for the P5. What's been interesting is that at least so far, while the Eswatini consensus has provided the AU in a sense, put it in a position in a sense as kingmaker, because of course it's a solid block of 54 countries. So far, the AU members have not specified which of the African countries should be put forward for the 2 envisioned permanent permanent members. And this isn't totally surprising, obviously, given the incredible sensitivities, and one could imagine regional rivalries. We have 2 chapters by authors talking about South Africa and Nigeria, but then there are others, potential plausible players, Egypt, for instance, Ethiopia, Kenya. There are others. Is it incumbent at this point for the AU to, in a sense, bite the bullet on this question and to break the global logjam? And do you think pressure is mounting on the bloc to identify these countries, for instance, to reach agreement with the G4 coalition, which would seem to be plausible?
Indeed, I think that there's the two sticking points have been firstly around which African country, which of the AU member states would be included as a permanent member. There's a great deal of resistance to the idea that it would be, so for outsiders, obviously it would be Nigeria and South Africa, maybe Egypt in there. But when you raise this in forums in diplomatic forums with other Africans, there's a lot of tension around it. And so it's this big issue, big elephant in the room that needs to be resolved. It was interesting to me at the BRICS summit last week or 2 weeks ago that the declaration was the strongest declaration supporting the candidacy of Brazil, India, and South Africa. When China and Russia have always been quite resistant to that within the context of BRICS. And so it was interesting to hear that. But now that Egypt is going to be a part of BRICS, what that does to that relationship, I don't know. The second thing that I do want to just raise is around the veto power. So for African states and for the AU, the position has always been that for as long as the veto is there, it should be applied to everyone. So it's either we all have the veto or no one has the veto. And I think that that's been, and certainly many scholars from the continent have criticized the AU's attachment to the veto, because in many ways incumbency is even more important. Incumbency and permanence is even more important than the veto power. And we know that the veto has also been a sticking point between the AU and the G4.
Thank you so much. That's a really wonderful overview, and perhaps we'll come back to the veto again and potential limits on it. But wanting to be treated equivalently to the others as long as it exists is very interesting. But again, the power of incumbency also being very, very important. Let me turn to Rohan. I'd love to get some thoughts from you about the justification behind India's claim to permanent membership and its insistence on the veto. I'm wondering whether or not, what is India's position in a sense, and on what basis does it make its claim to permanent membership? And is it coordinating its position with the other G4 members? I've also been a little bit surprised that the Modi government has not made a bigger deal of this in some of its bilateral meetings, for instance, with the United States or in its G20 presidency. And I'm wondering, is this a relatively low priority domestically, or is it really sort of the brass ring or golden ring that India continues to strive for?
Thanks. Thanks for having me, first of all. So I think, there's two parts to the question. One is, I think, what's the basis of India's claim? And here I think, or why is India even sort of making a claim of this nature, and has been for decades at this point? I think, first of all, India's power is rising, right? I mean, that's the most obvious thing. And this translates into a desire for greater voice and influence in global governance. And at this point, it's particularly opportune for India to make these claims because China is seen as a threat to international order in many quarters, and so India becomes an even more important actor as a major Asian power that also has conflicts of interest with China. So, in some sense, India is well positioned to make its claim because many actors or many countries want to actually engage with India at this point. India's claim is based largely, I think, on representation as well as sort of contributions to multilateralism or contributions to peace and security. So the geographical representation stuff is old. India has been doing that since the founding of the IAEA in the 50s, right? This idea that that there should be equitable geographical representation in UN bodies. So and then of course India emphasizes its contributions to peacekeeping, the 8 terms it spent as an elected member of the UN Security Council, suggesting that India has a lot of support in the international community. Um, on the G4, I mean, I think, yeah, from, again, it seems from statements and the way these actors coordinate their actions in the Security Council, at least in terms of the statements they make, there is a fair amount of agreement. There isn't that much dissonance between them. They have tended to speak with one voice. They also seek permanent membership with the veto, although they're willing to be more flexible about this. They support the 2 seats for the African group in the UN, and they've pushed for a larger UN Security Council than the US has traditionally wanted. So 25 to 26 members is the G4 position, whereas the US at least has traditionally wanted a smaller expansion. So yeah, that's really where India is at the moment, and I'm happy to discuss further. Yeah.
Sure. No, that sounds great. Yeah, and the question of size is quite interesting, and the U.S. and we'll get to this when I engage on Anjali. But what's interesting is this new proposal sort of at least suggests that the U.S. is actually open to a larger council, at least at a rhetorical level. I want to get a follow up though from you first, Rohan. Of all of the Security Council's membership gaps, I mean, for me, the failure to include India as a permanent member may be the most glaring and unsustainable, given India's population and its growing clout. And yet, China's opposition seems immovable, at least right now. My question to you is, what sorts of behavior might we see from India if its enlargement hopes are put off indefinitely? And one can imagine, India engaging in forms of international civil disobedience, etc., or just sort of taking its ball and going elsewhere and sort of not engaging with the UN. Are there other sort of diplomatic options on the table, or just does India believe that ultimately the trend is its friend in terms of it actually getting a seat on the council?
Yeah. So this actually links up to what you were saying earlier, which is India doesn't emphasize this too much in bilaterals or in the G20. I think that's partly because there's a certain sense that this is inevitable, right? That as India's power grows, other countries will welcome it into the councils of power. This has been a long-standing sort of Indian belief as well. I interviewed a bunch of Indian senior officials and elites in early 2010s, and they had the same view then. And so there is, in a sense, this feeling of inevitability. At the same time, I think venues like the G20 or BRICS offer alternative places where India can seek that representation that it is not getting at the UN. So I think what we're then going to see, if this is, as you say, indefinitely deferred, is India investing more energy, I think, in these alternative venues. And of course, they do different things. It's not that they can substitute for the UN Security Council, but there are venues in which India can have a greater say and more representation. And to that extent, India is also a member of the SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the AIIB. So it is, in a sense, hedging its bets in some sense.
Yeah, this is one thing that a trend that I've noticed as well, and I actually was going to mention it earlier, was the fact that when it's poignant now as the UN General Assembly starts to move, is that there are a lot of different multilateral and minilateral venues out there these days. And so whether it's coalitions representing the global South, whether it's the BRICS, whether it's IMSA, whether it's the SCO, as you mentioned, and the different G groupings, I think that this is a trend that reflects a lot of the fragmentation and hedging of bets that you're talking about. Let me turn to Anjali. I'd love to get your take on the Biden administration's reform proposal and the diplomatic outreach that the U.S. Has apparently launched in this regard. I mean, when you look at this, do you take this seriously? Do you see it as a major shift in U.S. policy and a good faith effort, or maybe a little bit more political theater to curry favor with some pivotal nations while maybe putting adversaries on the spot? I mean, it could in some ways be both, right? When I've talked to U.S. officials, they say, "Hey, look, we want to be caught trying," which is what teachers advise my children in elementary school. So, what's your take on this?
Yeah, I think it can actually be all those things, right? The first point, I think, is that UN Security Council reform is diplomatically popular, right? Everybody wants reform. The problem is that nobody agrees on what reform should look like, right? But being a P5 member who advocates for reform is a really popular stance among other UN member states, right? You, as you said, want to be caught trying, right? You don't want to be the P5 member who says, no, we think this is fine. Nobody thinks this is fine, right? But as the sort of status quo powerful state, it's particularly incumbent on you to advance a platform for reform if what you want to do is curry world favor, right? But, as you say, it's a really unlikely reform will happen, and everyone knows that. So there's a real way in which advocating for reform that won't happen could be read as either disingenuous or cheap talk, or could even be cheap talk, right? It's like almost like it's a costless gambit in some way, right? That said, the Biden administration has expended a lot of diplomatic capital on this, right? Unlike previous administrations. And they have advocated like 6 specific key principles for responsible behavior by Security Council members, including the standard commitment to defend and act in accordance with the UN Charter, to engage pragmatically with other council members on threats regardless of bilateral disputes, to use the veto in only rare circumstances, to demonstrate leadership on human rights and fundamental freedoms, to enhance the cooperation, inclusivity, and transparency of the working methods of the Security Council in particular, and via sort of substantive engagement with the General Assembly, via substantive engagement with other bodies, and then to advance efforts for Security Council reform. And as you noted, right, in a historic first, Joe Biden put Latin American and Caribbean permanent seats on the table, advocated for African permanent seats. Those aren't costless in the sense that they generate benchmarks against which the US can be held, right? The US is committing itself to particular and specific reforms. And some of those are actually reforms of practice, things that the US can do differently without having to engage in charter reform, regardless of whatever else other permanent members do. And so there is some sense in which there's a good reason to devote diplomatic capital to the effort, even if there's no likely outcome of full reform. Because part of what it does is that it also generates fewer places for other states to hide, right? The more specific the Biden administration gets about what kind of reform that they want, the more credible that sort of interest in Security Council reform seems, and the less cover other states have for agreeing with sort of the general urge for Security Council reform without any kind of specific reform. Now, in some sense, that's how you shift the diplomatic window on what's possible, right? By putting benchmarks on the table, by saying we commit to this, and you can see what we do, whether or not we meet these benchmarks. So a lot of other UN member states are likely to welcome those principles. Where the sort of challenge comes in, that every proposal is made in the context of knowing that other permanent members are going to object to the big ticket items. So to some extent, you can generate some commitments and have them stick. You can put other commitments on the table and know they're never going to be things that you're held to.
Can I follow up on the implications for the size of the council of the sort of ostensibly new U.S. position, right? Because in the past, as Rohan was intimating, the U.S. has been in favor of sort of expanded council of no more than 20 or 21, top heavy with probably new permanent members with or without the veto or some interim solution, right? But it begins to suggest a little bit more along the lines of even both the United for Consensus and the G4 sort of envision a sort of a 25, 26 member council, very different situation. But one could imagine that adding new permanent as well as elected members, creates the possibility for sort of blocking coalitions that you don't really get as much in the much more P5 dominated situation right now. Do you think do you think that there's been a shift in U.S. views of how big is too big?
I don't actually know. I think traditionally it's been 21. I think that the U.S. has said that the cap it wants is. The challenge, I think, is that the question of what constitutes a majority and whether or not new members get a veto or not, right, has a lot to do with the size of the council. And so each is dependent on the other, because if we have 20, 21, 25 members, the number of positive votes that you need to get shifts accordingly, right? So my sense is that this is a complex institutional design question. And the US has placed the cap at 21 in the past as the sort of desired outcome, which is lower, as you know, than other coalitions want, in part, at least, because it limits the size of the majority that you have to get in order to have something pass. But I don't actually know whether there must have been, because you can't put new permanent members on the table without thinking, is 21 still going to work? But I personally am not privy to those discussions.
Yeah, no, I mean, it opens a lot of work for us policy analysts and academics, frankly, to be able to kind of look at what the institutional design implications of all this would be in terms of decision making, because it would get more complicated for sure, even if it's more representative. And this brings me to another round of questions, which is honing in on whether the ultimate purpose of the UN Security Council reform should be to enhance its representation or representativeness on the one hand, or its effectiveness on the other. One of our contributors, Alexandra Novosilov, who wrote the chapter on France, made the point which sort of many realists make, which is, look, the council was never intended to be representative. That's the job of the UN Security Council, but instead it was to marshal the collective might of powerful nations to deter and, if necessary, crush aggression, right? And so I'd be interested to know whether this trade-off or dichotomy between representation and effectiveness is quite as clear as we often make it out. And I know, Rohan, in your paper, you had some thoughts about how legitimacy and performance relate to one another. So I might just ask you if you have any thoughts on this question.
Yeah, I mean, in a very straightforward sense, right? Too many cooks in the kitchen is always a problem. Like if you have too many people or too many countries, let's say, in any setting of decision making, or if you have, I guess more is worse than less in some sense when it comes to effectiveness, right? But I think the point that you just mentioned, which is another important thing, is that the Security Council was designed for the great powers to regulate conflict between themselves and then collectively regulate conflict in the rest of the world, right? And so there is a certain privileged position for the great powers that trumps sovereign equality and all the things that we sort of value in the UN system. However, I do think that there is an argument to be made here that representation matters in terms of how it affects the legitimacy of the Council's eyes in pivotal regional actors and coalitions such as the African Union or even countries like Indonesia, India, and so on. And I think that can affect impact the effectiveness of the Council, because over time, those who are disenchanted with its lack of representation and decision-making may actually walk away or look for other venues or try to dilute the influence of the Council by turning to the General Assembly. We've seen a little bit of that in the Ukraine war context. And so in a sense, if you continue to systematically exclude the much larger group of countries that is now sovereign, as Sithembile pointed out, that may over time erode the legitimacy of the Council and make it actually less effective, because then there's less incentive for everyone to comply with it if they don't agree with its composition.
Sithembile, did you have some thoughts on that, about this? Because you obviously have written quite a bit on the need for inclusivity. And how do you see the question of inclusivity and representation aligned with the effectiveness of the Council?
Well, I think if you look at the Council's record in assisting to resolve African conflicts, that says quite a lot about the challenge of the performance of the Council, given, Somalia, all the DRC, all these conflicts that are still ongoing. And part of the argument around the inclusivity and representativity of countries that have a different understanding of conflict is that it puts different issues on the table and seriousness engaging those issues that actually underlie many of the conflicts that are on the Security Council agenda. So African countries have been long proponents of linking development to peace and security. And Mozambique this year, earlier in 2023, convened a meeting around peace and security and the impact of development policies in addressing conflict. African countries have been, as non-permanent members, major proponents of real reform on how we deal with small arms, because in Africa, nuclear warfare isn't the threat here. It is, it's the proliferation of small arms. And so the argument here is that representation does impact which issues are taken seriously by the council and which issues are carried on a continuous basis. So what you've seen is that there'll be interventions by non-permanent members around particular issues, but as soon as Mozambique is gone, it'll rely on other African countries to try and carry those issues forward, but it has to wait until it's re-elected to the council to continue its agenda. And so I think that the link between representation and performance is really about what matters and what's discussed when you have a different set or different configuration of permanent members.
That's a really fascinating point, and it does come out in a number of the different contributions, including in the contribution from our Chinese colleague as well, who basically said, this Security Council reform is about values and also sort of really concepts of security. And as you point out, the link between security and development, obviously. A huge issue of importance in sub-Saharan Africa, and how one thinks about global threats, and how expansive the Security Council's agenda should actually be. Should be dealing with issues of climate change, for instance. There are many different aspects to this puzzle. I want to pivot a little bit on this sort of on the same topic, but to the degree that permanent membership should also be about practical contributions to peace and security, however one defines those. It has been suggested there should be some baseline criteria that potential candidates, particularly for permanent membership, should meet. And I would pose, in a sense, as a counterexample, the way Brazil has handled its candidacy. Matthias Spector, who's a non-resident fellow at the Carnegie Endowment, wrote a very interesting paper essay for us on Brazil's position. And as he makes clear, that nation has traditionally justified its candidacy in terms of representation, sort of value diversity, and also as in a sense, the hemisphere's obvious choice, or South America's obvious choice, without necessarily highlighting what it would bring to the table. And I guess an alternative approach would be to have a criteria-based model with potential thresholds or indicators of eligibility. I mean, one could imagine, for instance, using population, looking at it as a share of global GDP, or at least a share of global GDP of the region, the level of military spending, whether a country adheres to UN Security Council resolutions, is it willing to defend the charter, or does it contribute to peacekeeping? I'd like to get some thoughts on this, perhaps starting with Rohan. Is that a reasonable, should there be, in a sense, a litmus test for aspirants for permanent membership, or is that kind of unwieldy?
I mean, it's a really important question. I think so. The existing system was founded on the membership principle that the countries that won the Second World War essentially got to form the UN Security Council and decide who was in it, and also bring in China at the right time, or when China was able to come in, and so on. So, in some sense, there isn't a historical precedent for this, and so if one is to sort of take forward the arguments that countries like India and others make about equality, equal representation, and so on, they might ask for those very same standards to be applied to those who are currently P5 in the UN Security Council. And so if that is willing, if we're willing to, in a sense, universalize those criteria, I think then there may be more traction to them. If they were just used by those who sit in the privileged positions today to sort of adjudicate and gatekeep who gets to be in the club, that they might be less successful in that regard.
Any other comments on this particular topic before I move on? Any thoughts?
Yeah, I think there's, in terms of those criteria, kind of financial criteria are difficult for then most of the countries that want to get into the Security Council, just because of their, economic status. But something that I have heard being spoken about is contribution to peacekeeping. So which countries are contributing to actually operationalizing the agenda of the UN Security Council and actually doing the work of the Security Council. I know that's something that's come up from South Africa, which is, I think, the 15th largest contributor of personnel to peacekeeping missions, and the 6th largest of women peacekeepers. And so this argument that if you're contributing to the work of the council, then you should be able to have some say in the council's work on a more regular basis.
It's very interesting. It's looking at contributions from a wide perspective, I think. In this sense, who is actually doing the work in terms of the in terms of actually peacekeeping. I want to move on, if I can, to this question of breaking the logjam and sort of potential opportunities to do so. This is logjam is obviously longstanding. One major proposal to break the impasse, which is mentioned by one of our fellow contributors, Christoph Hoesten, who is the head of the Munich Security Conference, in his chapter on Germany, would be for the UN to finally authorize negotiations on the basis of a single rolling text, which has not been something that has been placed on the table. And the idea here is that you would force individual states to get quite detailed in terms of and actually go on the record in terms of what they want to see and compare choices side by side and put them to a vote. This is something that China in particular has long opposed, and indeed has put extraordinary pressure on the chairs of, or the presidents of the particular negotiating committees not to allow to happen. But it would hold some possibility of at least forcing countries to go on the record and conceivably get up to a 2/3 majority. Whether or not all the P5 would be on board or not, or be forced to cast a veto is another question. But let me turn to Anjali. Do you see a diplomatic pathway towards UN Security Council reform? One could imagine a climb down from the G4 to take, to agree to, interim or, sort of some sort of mid-level seat where you would have, it would be elected, potentially renewable, maybe a little bit longer term. You could also see maybe some sort of compromise between the AU and the G4 if there were some compromise on the veto. Do you have expectations that there could be a pathway forward, or do you think that this is too horn-locked?
I think, without trying to be too pessimistic, right? I think the best possibilities for breaking the logjam rely on creative solutions that don't require charter amendments. Right? And that, I think, is very disappointing for a lot of people who correctly identify the fundamental structure of the Security Council as the problem. But the fundamental structure of the Security Council is unchangeable without opening up the UN Charter. And so in that sense, I think, for the same reasons that it's very hard to get anyone in power to make reforms that require them to give up that power, right? The Security Council's logjam is built into the structure of the Security Council. And in that sense, there are lots of possibilities that rest on things like, maybe longer terms for non-elected members, maybe expanding out the elected membership, all of those things, which we know that in the past have fundamentally changed the nature of the Security Council. The Security Council today is very different than the Security Council was before there were more elected members. Those elected members are good multilateralists, right? They want to invest in the system. They want to change the working methods of the Security Council to make them more transparent, to make them more democratic. They want a more effective council. But to the extent that any reform is going to rely on the domestic politics of the P5 or the domestic politics of other key states, in order to amend the UN Charter, we have a real problem, right? Because I think we actually highlights the sort of giant problem with any charter-based reform in general, which isn't just about the P5, right? We can imagine why the P5 might not want to open up the charter and give up power that they hold very closely. The problem is, I don't think, if we think about the domestic politics of a lot of key members today, we could get the same global compact today, right? We could not get this deal today. So once we open up that charter, we have a whole host of secondary problems that come up. Like, we need a multilateral architecture to coordinate on problems that we can't solve through the actions of individual states or informal coalitions of states or minilateralism, right? And the arrangement that we have today is not fit for purpose. But given contemporary domestic politics and a lot of the key players, I don't think we could get a better deal necessarily if we start opening up the charter in ways that move beyond the P5, but are very clearly evident in the P5, right? Charter amendments wouldn't pass the US Senate, right? That's a critical point of, like, whatever the Biden administration says and wants to do, right? We're much more likely to get a worse deal or no deal at all. And so, I think one way to think about this is to think about creative ways to address and enhance the roles of other bodies in the UN system, of non-elected memberships, of more transparent practices that emphasize the value of multilateralism among the P5, right? We know that the P5 can agree to limit their use of the veto because the UK and France have, right? When we talk about, like, grandfathering members in, they're very sensitive to the fact that they wouldn't necessarily make the cut in a reformed charter. And part of their commitment to staying at the Security Council is not using that veto, right? I think, there's a lot of space to change the organization by consciously changing the modes of diplomatic practice and the methods of work at the Security Council, and by trying to better embody charter norms that we're just not doing yet, right? And I know it's possible to think of these shifts as sort of like a ticky-tack set of solutions in the face of really staggering injustice and really staggering horror. But I think another way to think about them is almost like a ship of Theseus kind of situation, right? Like, if you can't renegotiate the charter, you can rebuild the way the institution works from the inside in ways that don't require fundamental charter reform.
It's very interesting. What you're suggesting is, there's a Pandora's box aspect of this, beware, even if things don't look great, if the council's health is not yet terminal, it might be deteriorating. There's no guarantee that going down this road would actually create something. Well, first of all, it would be likely to lead to blockage, and any agreement might actually be less than what's on the table right now. That I think I take that very seriously, and I agree with you that there are, and we can get to this, but sort of limitations on how countries use the veto. It's not unsurprising. I don't think it's a coincidence that both France and the UK, whose positions on the council, particularly in the context of this notion of European overrepresentation on the council, it's no coincidence that they are probably the most abstemious in the use of their veto, having, I believe, not used it since about 1989. And so there may be ways of, they're also more, particularly in the UK's case, more used to sharing the pen in terms of some of the UN Security Council resolutions. I would like to move on. Again, building on Anjali, some of the points you just made. Sort of what happens if there's no reform, and what potential workarounds there could be. One of the things that you mentioned is this question of the UN General Assembly. And I'll throw this open to all of you. It seems to me that one of the surprising things we've seen in the wake of the paralysis of the Security Council with respect to the war in Ukraine is some increased activism with respect to the UN General Assembly, sort of building on the sort of Korean War era uniting for peace resolution approach, and then also passing a resolution, I believe, that declares that, or insists that, if a member of the P5 casts a veto, that within 10 days or 2 weeks or so, they have to actually appear before the UN General Assembly to express themselves, to explain themselves now and justify their actions. Now, this is, from what I gather, not legally binding, but it could, there is a question of, does it increase reputational risk, of great powers doing this? Would anybody like to comment on the UN General Assembly's role and its increasing role in the context of Security Council paralysis? Sithembile, are you trying to say something?
Well, no, I don't want to comment on this exact question. So I was just waiting for my colleagues to say something before I.
Yeah. Let me go to Anjali first, and then I'll turn to Sithembile.
Yeah, one way to understand. I mean, so the U.S., for instance, signed on to that Liechtenstein-led resolution that requires permanent members to explain their vetoes before the General Assembly. That resolution, I think, was on the table for many, many years before it got enough popular momentum to actually pass. And one place that we, I think, see the sort of fall down effects of Russia's invasion of Ukraine is that it's generated this energy around creative ways for the General Assembly to counter the Security Council. The Security Council, has the primary authority to regulate international peace and security, but the General Assembly has a parallel role in things like the human rights architecture of the UN system. It has the power of the purse in the UN system, and it has the power to open investigations, to authorize reports, to generate information to staff. All of those things are important other tools in the sort of multilateral architecture. One way I think we see this as being interesting and important, right, is through the sort of the human rights investigative mechanisms the General Assembly has been authorizing. The IIM in Syria, for instance, is a General Assembly-based mechanism that collects evidence of human rights violations to underwrite a sort of whole host of universal prosecutions, right? And in that sense, in the presence of no Security Council action, one thing other permanent members at the Security Council can do is throw their support behind these mechanisms and to say, look, this isn't everything, but it is also an important way to demonstrate that this matters and we can do something about it, right? We can support victims and try and generate accountability even when the Security Council is deadlocked. And so although there is no sort of binding set of resolutions that the General Assembly can pass, what's binding in international law anyway, right? It's functionally fictional, right? All obligations are voluntarily accepted. So why not behave as though those resolutions are important and as though those sort of commitments are binding?
So if I could just
yes, of course.
On that, I think that's so great points made by Anjali. I just want to add to that. I think while there are things that the General Assembly can do, I think there are things that the Security Council can also do, just to speak to your previous point, Anjali, right? Which is that it's one of these areas, the working methods, right? Because it hasn't gone unnoticed, obviously, in the rest of the world that the US is now more proactive because it needs to be, right? So what happens when the extreme scenario goes away and we're back to sort of the maintenance of peace and order in a world after Ukraine, whatever that might look like? And there, I think the Security Council can do more to consult with non-members on relevant issues, to provide institutionalized access to information, to report to the General Assembly in a more robust way, and also to think about things like the hidden veto or even the pen holding, which actually even China and Russia complain about as a P3 reserve, right? The pen holding system. And so there's a lot that the Security Council can do, to speak to your earlier point, to sort of provide pressure valve releases for this demand for reform by focusing on working methods. And that also engages the General Assembly in that way.
Thank you very much. I want to turn to Sithembile and ask you about potential workarounds, including adjustments to the Council's working method. Your paper makes an interesting point that, in addition to sort of opportunities to sort of share the pen in writing resolutions and controlling the agenda of the Security Council with members of the P5, you also suggest that the African Union has some interesting potential lessons on caucusing amongst its members elected members on the Security Council, the A3, for instance. Could you give us a sense of how that process has worked?
Yeah, sure. So what's been interesting with African member states is how they've tried to work around. So beginning even in 2007, when South Africa was an elected member to the council for the first time, it had membership in 2007, 2008, and started to institute regular meetings between the UN Security Council and the African Union Peace and Security Council. And I think they meet every second year, and those meetings are now standing meetings that happen between the UNSC and the AU Peace and Security Council to discuss the African conflicts that are on the UN agenda. That had never happened before. It also hadn't happened with where the UN would meet regularly with the regional organization on peace and security issues, where the Security Council would meet with the regional organization, and that started happening then. And then in like 2013, the AU passed a resolution to have the A3, the three African non-permanent members who are on the Security Council at any given time, be treated as a caucus, a formal caucus that represents the position of the AU on the council. And so, you know, that was promoted by Rwanda when it was on the Security Council, and then by South Africa when it was on the council again in 2019. And so now what we've seen, and was an innovation that was very stark to see during COVID, was a lot of, in 2020 with all the shutdowns, was common positions being taken by the A3, and they're having common media briefings around a particular issue and releasing joint statements, even at one point going to Washington to go lobby US Congress members on greater support on the use of UN peacekeeping funds for AU peacekeeping missions. And that's been something that the US has been blocking for a long time. So they just went to Congress to go speak about it. And so, you know, this innovation, you know, without the charter reform, to say, well, what else can we do to make this institution work in a way that benefits us and that allows the issues that we care about to be taken more seriously. And we did see the effect of that in 2020, where the Security Council's view on the election in DRC was actually, the lead for that was from the A3, despite France's discomfort with some of things and the US's discomfort, that, you know, they took their lead from the A3 members.
Can I pick up on this a little bit? We got a question in the chat which says, do you think it's possible to devolve powers for the UN Security Council to regional groupings based on security interest? And obviously under the UN Charter, I believe it's Chapter 8, it has a major role for and recognition of the role of regional organizations and sub-regional organizations. Obviously, those are quite well developed, for instance, in Africa and in other regions too, in ASEAN, for instance. OAS in the Western Hemisphere, in other regions that are less developed. Do you have thoughts on you know, for instance, there's been a big debates about the balance between the UN Security Council's role versus the African Peace and Security Council's role in Africa. Sithembile, do you have a quick response on that? And I'll turn to our other colleagues to see.
Well, certainly, the African position on this sort of that we must, for as much as possible, abide by the principle of subsidiarity. That the group that is closest to the conflict should be allowed to take the lead on addressing that conflict. And so you can see the intervention of, you know, South Africa has the most troops in the DRC being a SADC country. IGAD has taken the lead on addressing the issues in the conflict in Ethiopia. We can see what's happening in ECOWAS at the moment with the coups that have taken place in West Africa. And so for Africa, that's always been a standing position, that regional groupings need to have a greater say over peace and security in their regions, and that you sort of start from trying to address something at the lowest or the closest level and expand outwards accordingly.
Anjali or Rohan, do you have any thoughts on the relationship between regional organizations and UN Security Council in terms of the management of international peace and security, and how that division of labor should make this? There's burden sharing and there's also burden shifting, which is obviously a danger as well. Do you have any thoughts on from a regional perspective on these things?
I mean, the two regions that I know don't look anything like the African Union or the OAS, right, which is Southeast Asia and South Asia. I think neither of them have the capabilities to necessarily engage it in a multilateral way. They would like devolution only to the extent that they don't want external great power involvement in their regions. But if devolution was to mean coordination, I think it would be a different story. And I think there's a reason why Africa occupies so much of the UN Security Council agenda, which is a function of selection bias, right? That the more economically powerful countries are able to actually keep their issues off the agenda. This is what Sithembile was talking about earlier, right? Which is, power is also about who gets onto the agenda. And so as long as India keeps Kashmir out of the UN Security Council agenda, that issue doesn't arise to some extent. Yeah.
Anjali, do you have any thoughts? There's another question here, which is, could there be any model in which the P5 veto is limited in some manner? And then the questioner goes on to say, thereby promoting the AU to soften their veto stance. And this is and that's a question about, because if the AU softened its veto stance, it actually would be quite similar to, in a sense, the G4 position. And provided the AU could come up with its two candidates, there might actually be some forward progress here if there was a rolling text. And then it would force the P5 to sort of decide what they're going to do. But more generally, this question of veto reform is interesting. Charter amendment, presumably highly difficult in this regard. The veto, in my view, was the price that the P5, in a sense, exacted, and certainly the United States no less than any other country, in terms of their willingness to actually join the United Nations in 1945. But there have been some experiments with, whether it's the responsibility while vetoing initiative that Brazilians were pushing, whether it's sort of a level of self-restraint in the use of the veto, gentlewomen's agreements not to use it in the case of atrocities, etc., that have been mooted. How do you see this question of the veto evolving, and could it mollify some of the concerns that we've had about an unrepresentative Security Council? Anjali.
Yeah, so as we mentioned, the UK and France have had that gentle person's agreement not to use the veto since 1989. I don't remember how many years that is now, but however many years that is. The US's platform for reform under the Biden administration, one of their principles is limiting the use of the veto. The only time the US uses its veto is to shelter Israel, right? And the real question, we started out by saying the Biden administration's proposal establishes benchmarks that other countries can hold it against, or can hold the US's actions against. The real question is whether or not the US will agree to forego the veto in those cases, or to limit the use of veto in those cases. I don't know. I think a lot would have to. I don't know enough about the domestic politics of the situation, quite frankly, to know whether that's on the horizon. As someone who just pays attention, it seems very unlikely. But that, I think, would be the critical question, right? The U.S. doesn't use its veto that much, but it's very committed to the cases in which it does use its veto. And so, in that sense, whether or not it could go the route of the UK and France, I don't really know. And that's the critical question, I think. That informal agreement to not use it. One way to think about it would be to say, is the US going to get very good at keeping those issues out of the Security Council chamber, right? Because then they wouldn't have to use the veto. I think that's doubtful, because that veto is very unpopular, right? Like, it is not something that anyone else has an interest in letting the US get a walk on. And so in that sense, that would be the critical question to formulate, right?
Rohan, do you have any comments on thoughts on the veto and sort of India's insistence on it, or its?
I think it's counterproductive for India to keep insisting on the veto. I think that there has to be a way to sort of, otherwise, I think incremental reform is going to be more successful than, just to go back to Anjali's earlier very excellent point, right? I mean, if you're asking for the whole hog, you're not going to get it. And so accepting as much as it might be unpopular in India to accept something that looks like the UFC model of non-permanent membership as an interim step, I think as a process of continuous reform, rather than just talking about it for decades, I think that would be helpful.
It's interesting. So there's a bit of hope there towards the end, and notwithstanding the incredible hurdles that we've talked about. The nice thing is that the current circumstances at least illuminated some of the dynamics at play, and perhaps some very narrow windows for at least a partial forward movement. I want to thank all of you, Sithembile, Rohan, and Anjali. This has been a terrific discussion. We look forward to having you involved in the Carnegie family and our events going forward. And this is the first time we've actually met, at least face to face, albeit electronically. And so it's a great pleasure to have you with us. And I, again, thank you for your stellar contributions. I want to commend to everybody who is watching this really interesting compendium that I was privileged to edit on what the world thinks about UN Security Council reform. And we will see in the next couple of weeks whether there is much movement on this at the UN General Assembly. So anyway, thank you all very much for joining us, and this ends our program.